There was a bit of a formula to literary success during the golden age of detective fiction. You wrote one crime novel, it was a hit with readers, and so you wrote lots more. Some of the most popular writers I discuss on the show are also some of the genre's most prolific practitioners. From Agatha Christie with her 66 detective novels, to John Dixon Carr with at least 55, E.C.R. Lorac with over 70, Ngaio Marsh with 33, and so on. Anthony Berkeley's 20 and Dorothy L. Sayers' dozen feel like slight bibliographies by comparison, but even they appear prolific compared to the writer we're going to meet today, who wrote just one fully fledged Golden Age detective novel. And yet that one book had an outsized impact. It ran into over a dozen editions, it attracted attention from the most serious and severe critics of the genre, and it is still in print today, delighting people over 100 years after its initial publication. So why didn't he write more detective fiction? That's the mystery of A.A. Milne. Welcome to Shedunnit. I'm Caroline Crampton. Make sure you listen all the way to the end of this episode for a little surprise, and I'm going to give my standard spoiler warning here. I'm not going to reveal the solutions of any mysteries, but I am going to discuss some plot details of the books listed in the description, so if you're avoiding anything specific, please consult that before continuing. Yes, you did hear me correctly, and no, you didn't misread the title of this episode. I did say A.A. Milne, the same A.A. Milne you know and love as the creator of Winnie-the-Pooh, Piglet, Eeyore, Owl, Christopher Robin, and all the other inhabitants of the 100-Acre Wood. In a way, Pooh is also a creation of the Golden Age. He first appeared in Milne's book of children's poems, When We Were Very Young, in 1924, and then in the prose stories in Winnie-the-Pooh in 1926, and The House at Pooh Corner in 1928. Alan Alexander Milne was about a decade older than most of the writers who began their careers in the post-1918 golden age of detective fiction, having been born in London in 1882, and thus he had a writing career already established before he joined the army for the First World War. He graduated from Cambridge in 1903, where he had interestingly studied mathematics, not the more expected writerly degrees of literature or classics, and by 1906 he had landed a job at the satirical magazine Punch as assistant editor. He wrote short stories and humorous verse for the magazine, and then beginning in 1917 he also made a name for himself as a playwright and a screenwriter in the nascent London film industry. His comic play Mr. Pym Passes By, which was first produced in Manchester in 1919, became an international hit, with runs in the West End, Broadway and in Australia, as well as a silent film adaptation and then subsequent radio and television versions. Already by the 1920s then, he has switched form twice, starting in satire at Punch and then moving on to write for stage and then film. As I said at the start, most writers, especially those who do it as their living rather than as their hobby, tend to find an avenue in which they can be successful and profitable and then stick to it. But Milne was different. It isn't that surprising then that in 1922 he came out with something new again, a detective novel. As Shedunnit listeners well know by this point, the classic puzzle mystery was already very much in vogue by the time Milne's effort, The Red House Mystery, came out. Agatha Christie and Freeman Wills Crofts had both published successful debut novels in 1920, and the short stories of writers like Arthur Conan Doyle, G.K. Chesterton, R. Austin Freeman and H.C. Bailey that had appeared in newspapers and magazines did much to quickly feed the public's enthusiasm for the genre. What first strikes you upon reading Milne's book, I think, is that the author is clearly a fan and a voracious reader in the genre he is now working. I think he wrote The Red House Mystery because he just really liked detective stories. It was also a shared family obsession. The first edition of the book was dedicated to his father, with this inscription: "Like all really nice people, you have a weakness for detective stories, and feel that there are not enough of them. So after all that you have done for me, the least that I can do for you is to write you one. Here it is, with more gratitude and affection than I can well put down here." In a piece titled The Watson Touch, collected in a 1920 book called If I May, Milne explains that the Sherlock Holmes stories were really the origin of his own obsession with the genre. He even hints at the fact that he had tried writing his own detective story with a plot concerning a poisoned envelope flap, but had let it lie dormant while he was serving during the war, only to pick up a paper one day in the mess and read a published story that by chance used the same device. "Since then, I have fancied myself rather as a detective story writer," he wrote. "If only I could think of something which nobody else would think of while I was thinking of it, I would try again." And indeed he did try again, and to great effect. The story of the Red House mystery concerns the house of the title, where an upper-middle-class house party has been taking place. The Red House is not a grand country house in the aristocratic pre-1914 tradition, as Styles Court is in Agatha Christie's first novel. Rather, it is, to quote Raymond Chandler, a typical laburnum and lodge gatehouse inhabited by a man called Mark Ablett, who has pretensions to that old lifestyle, but who in fact recently inherited his money from an elderly woman who had befriended him as a boy, and he now likes to flash his cash around as a patron of the arts. To further cement the impression that this is not your usual posh country house mystery, Milne opens the book not in the drawing room or the library, but in the housekeeper's room, where Mrs. Stevens and her niece Audrey the parlourmaid are taking an afternoon break on a summer afternoon. Within the first chapter, though, their peace is disturbed. The master's no-good brother has arrived for a visit, and then a shot is heard. All very ominous. Next, Milne introduces us to the figure who is going to play the role of detective in his story, one Anthony Gillingham. A younger son of a fairly well-to-do family, he lives a strange life, using his private income of £400 a year to take as many different jobs as he can in order to see all sides of the world. We are told that prior to the start of the story, he had been variously a newspaper reporter, a valet, a shop assistant, and a waiter. It was while he was working at a tobacconist's that he met the character who Milne repurposes as Watson to Anthony's Holmes, Bill Beverley, a rather brainless but kind young man of independent means in the best tradition of P.G. Wodehouse. It is through his friendship with Bill that Anthony is brought into the murder investigation. He is down in the country on a bit of a holiday between jobs, having got out of the train at random because he liked the look of a particular station. Then he realises that the address from which Bill last wrote to him, the Red House, is nearby, so Anthony strolls over to make contact. As he arrives, he finds a man banging on a locked door demanding it be opened, and when they go together round the house and find another way into the locked room through the window, they jointly discover that it is occupied by a dead body, a man killed by a gunshot to the head. Since Anthony was in at the start, so to speak, he is required to remain on the spot to give evidence at the inquest, and thus ends up being invited to stay at the Red House with Bill, while the slow gears of the official investigation grind towards justice. Anthony thus decides that a new job, that of amateur detective, is called for, and he and Bill proceed to sleuth their way through the rest of the story in the best tradition of Holmes and Watson. The Red House mystery is, in its purest form, a detective fiction fan's attempt to satisfy his own tastes. I'm sure lots of us can recognise this impulse, and the thought has probably crossed all of our minds at some point. I've read a lot of these books, it would be fun to write my own one day. But not many of us actually follow through on that impulse. But Milne did, and to great success. The Red House mystery quickly ran into several editions, and when yet another new one came out in 1926, Milne wrote an introduction for it to explain his motivation in exploring this kind of writing. And it's a fascinating source to put alongside the novel itself. In this short essay, Milne sets out his own preferences about what a detective story can and cannot be. Some of his choices recall the more famous Decalogue that Ronald Knox was to pen a couple of years later, and the subsequent rules of detective fiction adopted by the Detection Club at the start of the next decade. Milne is a proponent of fair play, hating the final chapter dramatic reveal, and desiring that the detective should share what he learns with the reader along the way. He wanted his whodunits written in easy-to-understand language, without any sort of romantic plot, and for the murder to be investigated by a detective who uses logic and reason rather than science or esoteric knowledge to solve the crime. This last point may well be a loving dig at Sherlock Holmes and his cigarette ash, or perhaps our Austin Freeman's Dr. Thorndyke, who always seems to have already read up on exactly the obscure Egyptian hieroglyphs he will need to solve his next case. In addition, Milne felt that there must always be a Watson who can stand in for the reader and ask the questions the detective needs in order to explain himself. Milne's book is quite self-conscious about the tropes of detective fiction that it deploys, which is one of its pleasures for the seasoned mystery reader. He uses the verb Watsonize to mean the opposite of soliloquize, when Anthony wants to think aloud to Bill and to the reader. It's fun to note too that Milne touches on two other things that show up in subsequent lists of Golden Age rules: the idea of twins or doubles, and that of secret passages. Although on the latter point he is still within Ronald Knox's rules, having included just the one. After the break, Raymond Chandler is not best pleased. One of the many things about A.A. Milne's one-and-done career in detective fiction is how extremely successful it was. The Red House mystery ran into over a dozen editions and is still being reprinted today. Personally, I have a rather nice Vintage Books hardback facsimile that came out in 2008, and also includes Milne's 1926 introduction, but there have been others in recent years too. And for all that it is light in tone, the book has attracted some substantial critical attention. Julian Simmons, a great appreciator and interrogator of Golden Age detective fiction, turned his gaze upon it in his wonderful 1972 study Bloody Murder. He identifies Milne as one of what he calls the farceurs, a group of mostly British writers whom he defines in opposition to the so-called humdrum style that focused on things like railway timetables and unbreakable alibis. Think Freeman Wills Crofts. By contrast, the farceurs, he said, were those writers for whom the business of fictional murder was endlessly amusing. There's a bit of social history at work in this observation. It was possible for these British writers to treat violent crime as amusing, he argues, because Britain between the wars was a relatively safe place to exist, unlike perhaps some areas of America, and increasingly, in the 1930s, Europe, especially if you were of the class that these books generally focus upon. Milne's The Red House Mystery is, quote, probably the most entertaining book of this kind, Simmons says, and attacks on its handlings of improbabilities are a little unfair, since not much Golden Age detective fiction would stand up to such ruthless examination. The Red House Mystery's charm remains potent, despite its defects, he concludes. The attacks that Simmons mentioned mostly emanated from the pen of one very eminent writer, the founder of the American hard-boiled school of crime fiction, Raymond Chandler. In December 1944, Chandler published an influential piece of literary criticism in the Atlantic Monthly magazine titled The Simple Art of Murder. In it, he makes a passionate attack upon the Golden Age detective story, which he considers to have utterly parted ways with the precepts of reason and realism in which it purports to deal, while at the same time losing touch with the basic requirements of good fiction, such as lively characters, sharp dialogue, a sense of pace, and an acute use of observed detail. The Red House Mystery gets special treatment from Chandler, as an example of a novel that is offered to the reader as a problem of logic and deduction, while requiring said reader to suspend disbelief in order for its core plot mechanism to function. Chandler breaks this down in detail, but suffice it to say that Milne's story relies heavily on a piece of impersonation which would be very unlikely to hold up to even the most routine police work, and Chandler feels this undermines the very foundations of the Golden Age detective story. There is simply too much luck involved for his taste, although in that essay, The Watson Touch, Milne does say that must be the best of writing a detective story, that you can always make the lucky shots come off. So I think Anthony Gillingham's luck is an intentional addition on the part of his creator. I think what Chandler misses is why people like to read stories like Milne's, and thus why they have value. Speaking for myself, I can say with some certainty that it is not to learn more about the grim realities of crime and policing in the murder hotspots of the world. Once there were newspapers for that, and these days there are more than enough true crime podcasts on offer, should your tastes tend in that direction. No, I reread The Red House Mystery about once a year because it's fun, and it's funny, and I enjoy the way in which Milne combined charming characters and witty dialogue with a satisfying puzzle, even if the way it unravels could never have happened in real life. As Julian Simmons noted, the Red House mystery is no less pleasurable to read once you realise that its central disguise is a lot less opaque than the reader is encouraged to believe. That, I think, is a mark of quality in a detective story. There are those that I read just to discover the solution before instantly forgetting and discarding them, and then there are others that I can read over and over again just to appreciate existing in the scenario the author has brought into being. There is great deftness and skill involved in creating the latter type of novel, and just because the skill is worn lightly does not mean that it is not there. Aside from Chandler, Milne was well recognised for his achievement with the Red House mystery. The book was sufficiently popular and well reviewed to bring it to the notice of the other foremost practitioners of the genre in the 1920s. He became known to and friendly with the founders of the Detection Club, Dorothy L. Sayers and Anthony Berkeley. And when the club was brought together formally in 1930, Milne was among the first cohort of members to be inducted, a rare one who, along with E.C. Bentley of Trent's Last Case fame, was invited to join upon the strength of a single novel. I have said throughout this episode that A.A. Milne wrote just one detective novel, and that is true. Sort of. He never repeated the form or style of the Red House mystery, nor did he contribute to any collective Detection Club projects. But he did do some other crime writing that I think we should look at as part of this appreciation. Back in 1903, when he was newly come down from Cambridge, Milne demonstrated his vast knowledge of the Sherlock Holmes canon in a piece of comic commentary that was published in Vanity Fair under the title The Rape of Sherlock. I have seen this parody of a Holmes story described as an early piece of Sherlock Holmes fan fiction, and it is also, of course, a reference to the 1712 poem by Alexander Pope, The Rape of the Lock, which is a heroic mock epic about the cutting of a piece of hair. Milne's effort is a rather involved piece of Sherlockian literature, perhaps only of interest to the true fan, but it does nevertheless demonstrate his long-running passion for the crime fiction genre. Later on in the 1920s, Milne combined two of his writing styles and wrote a thriller play. The Fourth Wall was staged in London in 1928, and then transferred to Broadway for a 9-month run under the much better title of The Perfect Alibi. It is a country house mystery of a sort, with a murder that takes place at the end of Act 1, which is then followed by a Scotland Yard investigation, and, more interestingly, an attempt at sleuthing by one of the house guests. Her name is Susan, and it is her love of detective fiction that she feels qualifies her to take on the case. After the West End and Broadway runs, Milne then co-wrote a screenplay based on this play for the 1930 film Birds of Prey, again known as The Perfect Alibi in the US. The film starred, among others, Nigel Bruce, who, pleasingly to Milne no doubt, would go on later in the decade to play Dr. John Watson opposite Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes. The character of Susan from this play is intriguing to me, because I think it has a bearing on what I believe to have been Milne's last foray into writing crime fiction, his 1933 comic novel 4 Days Wonder. This is very firmly in the zone of parody, so those looking for the puzzle style of the Red House mystery will be disappointed, but it is no less charming for that. The book follows a heroine named Jenny, who wanders into her childhood home one day and discovers the murdered body of her wayward aunt. Without thinking, she proceeds to touch a few things and wipe up some bloodstains, before, as a fan of both sensational newspaper stories and detective novels, she realises that this will no doubt put her firmly in the frame for the crime. So of course she takes the most sensible way out of her dilemma, by going on the run in madcap fashion for 4 days, and leaving a complicated trail of contradictory clues and whirlwind romance in her wake. The book is great fun, and especially so if you are, like Milne, fully immersed in the detective fiction of the time. Characters reread crime fiction over dinner and constantly reference the minutiae of fingerprinting and telephone call tracing, as if everyone in the world is a crime fiction addict as a matter of course. At one point, a character invokes the spirits of Arthur Conan Doyle and Freeman Wills Crofts in support of Jenny's doomed escape. And there's some great dialogue along the lines of, "Oh, Derek," cried Jenny, "I've killed somebody." "Not again," said Derek, surprised. Although 4 Days Wonder arguably fails at the ultimate central purpose of a detective novel, it is a delightful homage to a genre that its author clearly loved very much. And so we come to that tricky question I posed at the start. Why didn't A.A. Milne write more detective fiction? He clearly enjoyed reading it, And his one true effort at it, the Red House mystery, was a substantial success. Some blame the enormous popularity of the Winnie-the-Pooh characters and stories, which came just a couple of years after his detective novel. And I'm sure that was part of it, but it can't be the whole reason, because he carried on writing plays and other things long after he became best known for the denizens of the 100-Acre Wood. My best guess comes from something he says in the 1926 introduction to the Red House mystery. He says that he slightly regrets writing the book at all, because although he was able to make it align precisely with his own preferences for the perfect detective story, this was ultimately a futile exercise. He, the intended audience for it, couldn't take his usual pleasure as a reader, because as the writer he knew what was going to happen. I think perhaps Milne discovered what a lot of us find when we try and turn a hobby we love into work. Something you've enjoyed on your own terms becomes much less fun when you make it a professional endeavour. He was wise then to realise this quickly, and stop after just one detective novel. He was free after that. Free to enjoy the rest of the golden age of detective fiction as just a reader, albeit one who was very astute about the creative potential of fictional murder. This episode of Shedunnit was written, produced and narrated by me, Caroline Crampton. You can find a full list of the books mentioned in this episode at shedunnitshow.com/The Mystery of A.A. Milne. I publish transcripts of every episode, including this one. Find them all at shedunnitshow.com/transcripts. Don't forget that my new book, A Body Made of Glass, has just come out and is currently available everywhere books are sold or borrowed. Keep listening to the very end of the episode for an exciting surprise on that score. Shedunnit is edited by Euan MacAleece. Production assistance from Leandra Griffith. Member support for the Shedunnit Book Club from Connor McLoughlin. Thanks for listening. And now, exclusive to Shedunnit, here is the opening of my new audiobook, A Body Made of Glass, which is read by me. Echo and Harper Audio present A Body Made of Glass, A History of Hypochondria by Caroline Crampton. This is the author. The rhythms of this ritual are deeply ingrained. Lean forward, closer to the mirror, bracing hips against the sink. Old bruises accepting the hard angles. One hand to pull my shirt away from my left collarbone, the other to poke and prod the shadow I saw there. It's very bright in the deserted bathroom at work. The overhead strip lighting bounces off the walls, the tiled floor, the gleaming white of the sink and toilet. In the mirror, the room behind me is blanched out of sight. All that is in focus is my own pale face and pinpricked pupils. Blotchy redness is rising out of my collar and climbing up my throat. Turning my head slightly, I avoid catching my own eye in the reflection. My gaze drops to the 2 square inches of skin on my neck to the left of my Adam's apple. This is the part of my body that most often flares into quivering sensation, and thus the part I know best. I could reconstruct it perfectly through touch alone, my fingertips following the baseline of the long-healed scar that snakes along parallel with my collarbone and the squashy dips between the tendons running down my neck. But now I want to see it, to scrutinize it as if through a microscope. I know the pattern. On bad days when I'm tired and slow and the quick-fire crosstalk of my colleagues washes against my ears like jagged waves of sound, I will turn my head to avoid someone's gaze and feel it. The sensation of something soft and yet hard at the same time catching on the usually smooth mechanism of my pivoting neck. A feeling at once horribly familiar and completely alien. It's like going downstairs in the dark and miscounting so that your foot connects suddenly with the floor when it was expecting to keep on passing downward through the clear air to another step. A sudden jolt and an electric pulse ripping through the stomach. An intruder is detected. I know the pattern but can still be stuck in it. I'm pretending to sit at my desk and type normally, but I'm actually listening to the roar of panic in my ears while conducting a fierce argument with myself. It keeps revolving, a sing-song, meaningless wrangle. You know it's not real, but this time it might be real. The outcome is always the same. I always end up here, in front of this mirror, staring at this glassy, reflected version of me, quietly weeping and poking myself in the neck hard enough to leave marks. What my questing fingers are looking for is evidence of a lump, a bulge of flesh that shouldn't be pushing its way out of my neck and yet somehow is. Except I can't put it that clearly in my own mind. All there is inside my head as I search is blistering static and a dogged whisper of, it can't be, it can't be. Tumours have a certain texture, I've learned. A hard kernel moored deep inside with a slippery casing that can move over muscle and under skin. When I found one in this part of my neck before, nearly a decade ago, I could roll it between my fingers. It danced across the sinews as I moved my head. It made a clicking sound I could hear with my tongue. While I'm still poking and staring, my brain wakes up and thoughts start to accelerate away from me. If there really is something growing in my neck, all the images in my mind are fairy tale malevolence, poisonous yet invisible roses creeping through my flesh to bind my life with their thorny tangles. My existence will be forever changed by it. I will have to deliver the bad news to my husband, my parents, my sister, my friends, navigate the peculiarly modern dilemma of deciding how much of a highly personal tragedy to share with strangers on the internet, give up my work once I can no longer reliably put words on a screen, manage with less money yet somehow pay someone else to walk my dog when I'm too weak to do it. Does anyone know the password for my computer? And if not, how will they get into my email after I'm dead? I haven't stopped probing my neck all the while, my methodical fingers on autopilot, but I'm also now wondering what is involved in making a digital will. When I finally snap out of this logistical reverie, my neck looks flushed and mottled in the mirror, and the poking has finally woken up the few remaining nerves. They half-heartedly pull together in ache, but I can barely feel it. I haven't found anything definite, and the panic ebbs ever so slightly. The subcutaneous ridges and hollows of scar tissue from previous operations give me some concern, but I know those of old. To know for sure if there is a real lump there, I need something better than just my clumsy fingers stabbing at the skin. I need to look from the inside. I need the knowledge and the equipment that turns opaque, ordinary flesh transparent, like glass, so that whatever is lurking within is exposed to the light. And to do that, I need help. The first few times I experienced this panic at the office, I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I waited it out until the end of the working day somehow, and then I went to a walk-in clinic so that a nurse could prod my neck for a while. I tried to answer questions about what I thought I'd felt, and condense my years-long medical history into a few brisk sentences, a sketch map of sorts for a newcomer to my personal medical labyrinth. Each time the outcome was the same. The nurse couldn't feel anything, so was unable to refer me for more tests, but also, given my history, wasn't prepared to give me the absolute definite negative that would send me skipping home, my mind liberated from panic and free to worry about more mundane matters again, like what to pick up for dinner and whether there really is a wasp's nest growing in our attic. If I'm still worried, I am told for the umpteenth time, I should contact my previous doctors and make an appointment, but for now I need to stop bruising my neck or I'm going to inflame my old surgery wounds. I thank the nurse, button up my coat and go home. To have a consultation now, I'd have to take a day off work and several trains. It always ends the same way. Whenever I receive this advice, I think about all the doctors I have seen in the past, about all the kind efforts to put my mind at ease, even though they cannot give me the guarantees that I want, about the symptoms that I have described, again and again, only to be told when tests for more serious conditions come back negative that I should lose a bit of weight or try to lower my stress levels. about how my mother once fainted and slid from her chair to the floor when a consultant delivered a life-altering diagnosis to her daughter. He just sat there and watched his words make her fall. I was 17, and I hated him with a sudden searing passion that heated my body from the inside. Later, I used to daydream about making a miraculous recovery so I would never have to see him again. After enough identical appointments like the one with the nurse about my neck, I stopped bothering to seek medical help when the shadow tumour flickered into being. I could do my own examination, my own weighing up of probabilities. It was more efficient, I found, to surrender completely to the panic when it first surfaced, sneaking away to the office bathroom to know the worst before washing my face and returning to work. The sharp jabs of panic still hurt, but I know what I have to do to ride them out. Sometimes I can go from definitely dying to rude health inside half an hour. This time, I'm almost there. The tears have dried up and a strange bubble of mirth bursts in my throat as I turn on the tap so I can splash my streaky face. My little chuckle echoes in the empty bathroom, the first sound I've made since I entered. All of the roaring was inside my head, as was the lump that I could feel but not see. You are allowed to think it. I can hear you thinking it. I am a hypochondriac. Or, at least I worry that I am, which really amounts to the same thing. The fear that there is something wrong with me, that I am sick, is always with me. I doubt that what I experience are physical sensations, and I distrust my own interpretations of what I feel. Sometimes the anxiety is distant and muffled, like a radio playing in another room of the house, barely there. At other times, it is all I can hear. Illness and the dread of it are entirely individual experiences. Only I can have my sicknesses, real or not. Only I can truly know how they feel. And as such, hypochondria is very difficult to isolate or identify precisely. A self-help guide on the subject published by the UK's National Health Service tries to pin it down by including a transcript of common recurring thoughts that someone experiencing anxiety about their health might have. The second one on the list is, I feel I am unwell. I have this thought almost every day. It wasn't always this way. For the first 16 years of my life, I was gloriously unaware of my own state of health. I experienced the usual cocktail of childhood maladies, from chickenpox to tonsillitis, but being ill was merely a temporary state that passed after a few days of rest and the ingestion of the right medicine. Once I was on my feet again, I never gave my sickbed a backward glance. If I had thought about it, which I didn't, I would have said that I believed implicitly in the easy binaries of sickness and health. I was either well or I wasn't. To be healthy is to be oblivious, to enjoy the luxury of never having the degradation of the body intrude upon the mind. In the stories that I have told and retold myself about my sicknesses, these healthy years are a joyful blank, a silence filled with life. The watershed in my understanding of myself, the before and after moment, came when I was 17 and on the precipice of adulthood, cautiously looking over the edge at what my independent life might be like. I was applying to university, making new friends, getting serious about writing. Then a busy winter of feeling run down culminated in me being diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a relatively rare type of blood cancer. After months of treatment, I was given the all clear and went off to university as planned. But then, during my first year at college when I was 18, I found a lump in my neck that turned out to be a return of the cancer that was supposed to have been permanently purged from my body. I required more chemotherapy, a stem cell transplant, and a weeks-long stay on an isolation ward, a sequence of progressively more invasive and dangerous treatments that ramped up as the persistent threat of this apparently curable cancer grew. Years of monitoring and testing followed before I was eventually declared cured at the age of 22. The medical staff who had seen me through all of this waved me off with smiles, joking that they hoped never to see me again. Once I made it to 5 years after the end of the treatment, the likelihood of my getting cancer again had become about the same as for the rest of the population. There were no more annual checkups, no more preventative medications, no more scans. My body and my life, they said, were cancer-free. But I am not free.